Hello and welcome to the Wakbada Bassett Creek Oral History Podcast, where our guests discuss ways that they and other indigenous peoples have lived, worked, and played in the Wakbada watershed for thousands of years. This project was created in Minnesota Makoche, or Minnesota, the traditional and contemporary homelands of the Dakota people. The project was co-led by Dr. Casey Keeler and Crystal Boyd, with support from community partners. More information is included at the end of this episode. On behalf of everyone who contributed to this project, thank you for tuning in.
Good afternoon. I am joined today by Tawnya Stewart. Thank you, Tawnya, for joining us for the Wakpadan Bassett Creek Oral History Project. To begin, when and for how long have you lived or worked in the area surrounding Bassett Creek?
My family has been here for quite some time. I want to say it must have been third grade. We started in Minneapolis, and then I believe it was the third grade that we moved to the Robbinsdale area.
What brought you and your family to this area?
So my parents, we were in Minneapolis, and we were sort of a growing family. We instantly grew. And when they started to think about the education that they wanted us to have, I believe it was District 281 was notably scoring the best in terms of education, and they wanted us to have a good education. And so that is how they selected Robbinsdale.
All right. So I feel like this is going to be a great interview. You know, you mentioned that you grew up as a youngster in Robbinsdale, but now as an adult, you live in Golden Valley. And knowing what you just shared, that you moved to this Bassett Creek region because of education. What school did you attend? And then were you involved in any Indian education programming through the school district?
Well, Casey, that was many years ago. So the schools that I attended, I went to Lee Elementary in Robbinsdale, and then Sandburg Junior High, which is in Golden Valley. And then high school, again, there were some things, schools combining and separating. Yeah. And so I ended up, I went to Armstrong High School. Now, back in those days, there wasn't a lot of Native American studies. So unfortunately, that wasn't really something that was offered at that time. Yeah.
Right. This also has me interested in when K through 12 Indian education programming actually began. Like, I don't even know the answer to that.
Yeah, I don't remember. I mean, a lot of what I learned about my nativeness and was really through attending community powwows and so there just wasn't a lot in school.
Right.
Quite honestly, it just didn't exist.
I mean, I think the same is probably also true still today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Did you know any other Native families or individuals in the area? Either then or even now?
Unfortunately, no. As I think about it, I'm Native and African American, and so there was no families that were Native, like in my area. There were also no African American families in my area. So, and even today, I don't know anyone who lives out here who might be Native. Yeah, I just don't.
Well, I am doing 13 interviews, so there's at least 12 others.
Okay, I hope so.
Thinking more specifically, being raised in Robbinsdale or even now in Golden Valley, if you're willing to share, what neighborhoods did you live in? Did you grow up or live in a house or an apartment complex or a townhouse? And then was your family able to access home ownership, or were you renters?
Mm-hmm. we were homeowners. So, but again, I think we're talking about the 70s when we moved to the Robbinsdale area. We were in Minneapolis and then moved. But what was interesting, our home, when my really my aunt and uncle who raised me, when they bought the home, they literally had to get approval to move to the area because they were the first Black family to move to that street in that neighborhood. And so oftentimes people were surprised that they were actually homeowners. We were previous homeowners in Minneapolis, and we're buying, again, a larger house in Robbinsdale, but they literally had to get approval to move to the neighborhood.
Right. For me, in thinking about this project and American Indians in suburbs, or any people of color in suburbs, you can't have these really in-depth conversations without thinking about access and the history, the legacy of race-based covenants, and also even redlining in these areas. And I know the West Metro in particular has kind of been an area of focus for people looking at race-based covenants in places like Edina in particular, but also Golden Valley, Robbinsdale, Crystal. When I lived in Crystal, we were one block into Crystal from Robbinsdale. When I lived there, our home was built in the 1950s. And that was something we were interested to, was looking at the race-based covenants, because a lot of them don't say, no African Americans. They say no people nobody other than white, right? Only Caucasian people, unless you're like domestic help or servants. And we think about those as existing in the 1930s, but your family really had to break down barriers and get that access in the 1970s, which is pretty recent still. And so many of these race-based covenants, so they're not enforced, continue to exist today.
Yeah, you make a good point. We're uncovering some of that redlining and what has happened, and perhaps that was the case for where my parents were purchasing their home. And now you bring up a good point. Like, I'm interested to go look at the history of the property. I mean, they are actually still there, believe it or not, after all this time. And the home that I currently have was built in 1957. So I'm now curious. I should probably go look at the history of this. I mean, there's a rich history with this home. It's a mid-century. So I think after this interview, I'll probably go take a look to see what was being said, because unfortunately, that was prevalent within the Minnesota area.
Right. And nationwide. Sure. So there's a website called Just Deeds, for justice, and deeds because they're written into the deeds of the home. So this project came out of the Mapping Prejudice project, which looked more at redlining, but Just Deeds is kind of like a grassroots initiative for folks to do just what you said. To go find the deed of your home, look to see if it has a race-based covenant, and do the work to get that removed. Again, even though these aren't, enforced anymore, I think the symbolic aspect of doing that is significant, particularly if it's white people doing that, right?
Right.
But yeah, I mean, if you looked at the deed to your home right now, like theoretically, could you even have purchased that in the 1950s when it was first built and the deed was created? It's interesting to think about.
Well, I'm going to say this, Casey, because I think before I did buy this house, and I've been here a couple of years now, but even today, this might sound weird, but I had made about 9 other offers during my offer process, and I literally was all over from Golden Valley to Plymouth to Maple Grove to Bloomington. I was making offers all over. But at one point, I told my realtor, please don't put my first name, just put my first initial, because I was concerned about the racial dynamics of buying a home. And so she's white, Julie was like, what? She couldn't believe what I was saying, but I had recently come across the Jim Crow of the North documentary. And I also was concerned that I could be discriminated against even in purchasing my home a couple of years ago, right? And so, not that anything happened specifically, but I was concerned about that. And I did not want that to get in the way of my offer, right? And so I started to just ask for a first initial and last name and really try to leave out anything that might uncover that I was Native and African American. So those are things that actually still came to my mind while I was purchasing even this home in Golden Valley.
Right. I mean, that's a lot. That's heavy stuff to think about, that people who are white don't necessarily have to think about when they're accessing homes, and going through that process, which has only become more complicated and more competitive in recent weeks, months, and years.
Yeah, for sure.
So when you moved to Robbinsdale, did you have any other family in the area?
We did not. So again, I think we were the first family of color on the street. We had no family, and it's interesting now. I thought we moved. We used to say, "Oh my God, we live in the boondocks." We thought we were so far. Like as a kid, you're going 5 miles seemed like a very long ways, and so we were like, "Oh my gosh, we're way out here in the suburbs." And now, what is it? 10 minutes from Minneapolis, if that. So, but no, we had no family. We were maybe one of the first families that, like I said, moved to the area. So no family. Yeah.
So today, living in Golden Valley, I know you shared with me you're able to work from home. Do you travel from work, or were you home based even before the pandemic?
So no, home. Well, I mean, I have the flexibility. My offices actually, believe it or not, are in Onamia, Minnesota. So that's like 95 miles north on the reservation. So our headquarters are located there. The casinos that I work for, we have actually about 30 different businesses in our portfolio. But I would travel north to get to the office and had a lot of flexibility even then. So I might spend a day or two up there and then work remote.
That's nice that you had that flexibility. So Mille Lacs, don't they own property right in St. Louis Park?
Yeah, we do. We do. And
St. Paul.
And St. Paul. And so, and then we have a marketing company that was in South St. Paul. But so what we started to do, and I think as in my role, building the culture of the company, I wanted to give people that flexibility. And so we ended up creating what we call the urban office. So in St. Paul.
Okay.
Because as we were hiring people from the University of Minnesota or wherever, some folks just didn't have transportation or desire to work in rural or remote areas. So we did create an urban office for people who live near the city here. Yeah.
I mean, that seems important too, when you're thinking about economic development and where that really is unfolding kind of in the Twin Cities, not necessarily in Onamia.
Right.
And understandably so. So when you think about Bassett Creek in the watershed region, do you think about this area in particular ways as a Native person?
Well, that's an interesting question. And then I would say, unfortunately, I haven't thought of it in this way. One little tidbit, I was actually born in Golden Valley. There was a hospital, so I'm coming back home in some weird way, but I've never thought of it in that way.
Yeah, I think this question too, for people who identify or are Dakota, I think they might have some more connection to place.
Sure.
So on the contrary, or maybe on the flip side, more accurately, how do you think about living in a place like Robbinsdale or Golden Valley, a predominantly white place, as a Native person or a Native and African American woman?
Well, I think, like I said, I was literally born in Golden Valley, so I feel like I'm coming home. Mm-hmm. But there aren't many people like me that I've seen around, even in the last couple of years or even historically. And so I think with my parents still in Robbinsdale, I'm here in Golden Valley. It just so happened, right, that it worked out after about 9 offers that I got this place. And so I don't see much diversity here. I just don't. And I would say I kind of have a love-hate relationship, because I like the quietness of it. I like the surroundings. Oftentimes and sometimes, I'm don't feel like it's home. Right. That does happen here as well. So it's been an interesting sort of dynamic of being here, but I know for me, it's where I'm supposed to be.
Yeah. But, it's like kind of, feeling like you're at home because that's where you've always been and lived.
Yeah.
But it's not always necessarily home in terms of like that strong cultural or community connection. Like the home, it's home because that's what you've made it. Yeah,
absolutely. And when I share that this is where I live, it's the response has been, what, really? Where? I know about, like, they're surprised I even know where this place exists. So, and then I have to go, oh, I grew up around here, and I have to, like, I'm always explaining my connection to the area, which I've gotten used to, but it's sort of off-putting, if I'm being honest, because again, I grew up in the area, all the way from, like I said, 3rd or something grade, all the way to high school. So,
right.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting too, as you mentioned, Golden Valley, Robbinsdale is really only like 5 miles out of downtown Minneapolis, if that. And we are so familiar with thinking about Minneapolis's urban Indian community. Right. But when we think about the inner ring suburbs, it somehow seems like so far removed. And then on the flip side of that, so much of my own research and interests are rethinking suburbs as historically Indian places. So we know that, Dakota people and even Ojibwe people like transverse this landscape. I grew up in the North Metro, so places like Coon Rapids and Anoka. I think there's more fluency and familiarity with Ojibwe. But similarly, I feel like there's this big disconnect of like, how can you be Native and live in a suburb? Like, why?
Oh, yeah, it just doesn't align with, I think, when you think about either stereotypes or what people have come to know about Native people, it kind of shakes their understanding of what they've always thought. And again, everything we did was out, I'm very familiar with how to get around and my friends, my educational experiences. Again, there are very few to none, no Native friendships. There are people that I came across other than my sisters, but again, usually there's a response that like, wow, I can't believe you actually grew up in that area.
Right.
So, I don't know what to make of that. I try to tell the story of, it just felt very natural and normal to me. But, and then even myself as a Native person going into Minneapolis near Franklin and around there, I think those stereotypes are reinforced, sadly enough, but I also know that there are many of us too have different, upbringings as well.
Right. Right. I think this project can also, highlight the diversity of Native experiences. Increasingly, we know that Native people live off reservation and in metropolitan environments, but outside the urban core. Yeah. So folks like us who did grow up in suburbs are actually more representative of a growing population that didn't live on the reservation and that didn't live in a really recognizable urban Indian community.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So were you, as a youngster, are you today involved in any cultural activities in this area? Is this something you went to Minneapolis to partake in, or even return to your reservation community for?
So great question, Casey. A lot of the cultural education or experiences that I'm currently having are not necessarily happening here in Golden Valley. I do go to the reservation for ceremony occasionally, or we have, our powwows at both Mille Lacs and in Hinckley, and any sort of dish settings typically happen there. Because of the Zoom and internet, I've been able to I just finished some schoolwork, and I tried to take an Ojibwe language class, and that was offered through Zoom, which was great. I need to pick that back up, but again, not much has been offered in this area. Yeah. And or like I said, if I were to, sometimes the urban office might offer a powwow or something, so I would definitely head there. So not much happening here in Golden Valley. So
yeah, some of the other folks I've spoken with were involved for this project, have been involved in Indian education programs in Robbinsdale or neighboring Osseo. So those programs, I think, have really grown and done important work for the youth. I've also learned recently that Breck has a decent number of American Indian students in their school, which is pre-K through 12, which I did not know at all.
Wow.
Yeah.
I would think, and maybe Blake, yeah, I didn't know that. You know what? You make a good point. You probably should talk to my sister, who again grew up. She's in the Robbinsdale school system. She's a communications director, executive director. And I understand that they actually are creating programs for Native youth and African American youth.
Oh, wow.
To work as liaisons for students, but I don't know really what the population is. But I think there's a level of understanding within the actually back to District 281, where they recognize there's a need to support these students, something we did not have, back in the day. So right. I think there's recognition of Native educators and again, kind of, I don't want to, cultural groups that, again, that are supportive of the different students that exist within the school district. So yeah, that's something we didn't have, right? We just didn't have.
So Haha Wakpadan is the Dakota name for Bassett Creek. What do you think about the role of and importance of languages and place names, particularly in predominantly white settler places? Well,
if we're being honest, right, Minnesota is a Native word. And so as much as we can embrace that, and as much as we can, where we can identify our language or languages that are Native originating, I feel there's an opportunity to coexist as we have over the many years. I think there's that opportunity for acknowledgement. Again, there's a lot of history and stuff that's been left out of our history that I feel is worth exploring and acknowledging once. And I always say, when you know better, you do better. When you learn something, and sometimes we have to learn and unlearn and then learn again. And I feel like we're kind of in this interesting place, kind of collectively within the United States, where we're getting a better understanding of what the true history is. And I think there's opportunity to acknowledge each other in ways that are respectful. So I mean, that's kind of where I'm coming from as I'm learning more myself. Yeah.
Right. Something that you said right off the bat when I asked you that was, we need to learn to coexist. So what came to mind for me was the ease of something like dual language signage.
Yes.
I'm reminded of that when I look at your background as well. Is that something they have at Mille Lacs, do you know? And is that something you feel that could be incorporated in a suburban environment like the Golden Valley, Wakpadan region?
We have some, like, for example, like we have our Ojibwe values and we have the English version of the word. And then you also see the Ojibwe word. I'm not proficient. I know enough. I know words. Like I said, I'm still learning the language. So I think it's all about education, right? And so there's probably a story here, Casey, that needs to be told. And I think, again, this is all new for me learning today. And we don't have as much dual language, or, I feel like that's still a step we should take even as a company. But I see where even when you think about Bade
Makaska,
yes. And again, the importance of that change, and there's a whole thing there. And I haven't done all my research on that, but I do see where those acknowledgements, even though there was sort of some pushback on that, but it's the right thing to do. And again, as we learn and unlearn things, that we should acknowledge that. So we haven't done it to the extent that I think that we could. I don't think this area has, but I see that as, because you're right, like you go to meetings, sometimes people say, we want to acknowledge the land that we're standing on and rah, rah, rah. And then that's very nice. But what else, aside from that statement,
right, what
else are we doing to really look out who was here first and give that acknowledgement and respect, and again, teach each other about it, right? So that's kind of where I come from.
You're so spot on. Even though we're Native women, we don't have all the answers, and we are also always learning, just like so many of our peers and community members. There aren't very many of us that speak our native languages fluently. So it's also always learning. I grew up in the Twin Cities, but I'm not Ojibwe or Dakota. So it's also like you need to learn the history of those communities who do call that place home, whose homeland you're also occupying. So even as Native people, we also need to learn other Native communities' histories and stories as well. But on the end there, you touched on land acknowledgements. So this leads to the next question. So this oral history project grew out of a land acknowledgement process with the Valley Community Presbyterian Church. So when you think about land acknowledgement statements, what is your initial reaction? And then after the work has been done to create a responsible and respectful land acknowledgement, what follow-up supplemental work would you like to see?
Okay.
In an ideal world.
That was a really big question. I'm like, hold on a minute. So I want to say, first off, like, respectfully, I feel good when I hear a land acknowledgement. And again, I think there's been different reactions. But I personally believe it's, again, I admire that, and I think it's important. I like the idea to what you were saying, where there's possibly dual signage and more kind of education, like even in the community ed that is offered, through the different cities. Just sort of creating something around, again, American Indians in suburbs, like that is a class in itself, right? People just don't have that level of understanding. And again, I can't imagine, I don't know what the interest level is, but I think if I were to, wave the magic wand and think about where do we go beyond land acknowledgement? I think there's community classes. I think there's dual signage. And, to your point, there's work that even I consider, you're right, there's many tribes in the state of Minnesota. And I think this region in general has so much, a rich history of the various tribes and experiences. And so, I personally am planning to dig in and become more familiar with not just our tribe, but others to that point, respectfully. At the end of the day, right, how do we just acknowledge each other and recognize kind of where everyone came from? It's very, it's just a dynamic story, and there's so much here. It's so rich. And so I think there's just that creating those opportunities. We're doing that even in our company. Like, we have something called Brave Space, where once a month we either bring in a speaker or a movie or a book, or just really start to have these sort of conversations that may not happen organically or naturally. And someone like yourself who has interest in this space, like just kind of creating those and sharing the culture and helping people understand what's appropriate or inappropriate, or the names of teams and why that's offensive. And, just having sort of these open dialogues where there can create more community, just around some of these issues that probably, we can all, take a class on pottery. We can take a class on square dancing. We can take, there's all these classes, but like, why not pull through some of these cultural, I know in our community, we have ribbon skirt, how to make a ribbon skirt, how to make a hand drum, where, just sort of the storytelling. Sometimes you bring in an elder and they just do storytelling. And so weaving some of these cultural experiences into the offers, so that, sometimes we find things sacred and we don't want to just put it out there. But I do think there's probably some things that could be shared and discussed.
I agree. And things that could be shared and discussed that other folks are interested in and eager to participate in conversations about. Something I've been thinking about over the last few days as I've been doing these interviews is that through this project, we haven't really thought about intentionally bringing all of you who are participating in the interviews together, but that's something I want to propose to the larger project team. We know we're going to have some excess money in our budget, and I think it would be really great to host like a brunch or a luncheon with all of you folks who have so generously participated in this project, but also to continue these conversations that we've had about being Native in the suburbs, and how has that kind of shaped our identity? Have we even really reflected on it seriously or critically until this point? And what does that mean for the future as well?
No, I think it's brilliant.
I'm glad you may be interested.
No, and thank you for doing this work. Again, who knew? I just think it's a story that's not been told. I think it's an area that we kind of skip past. And again, there's a lot of experiences here. And I think that, again, sort of pulling everyone together, I think is really a great idea. And, you're used to just sort of being the lone Native person, like you don't think anyone else exists. And it's, surprising and refreshing to know that there are other folks out here that have had this experience, and just being able to share and talk about it. Right. And then like thinking about those who are coming, well, my son's in college now and he's out of state, but if there were young people coming through, like, what does that experience look like? And just knowing that they really belong.
Right. I agree.
And thinking about even what are we teaching others in history class about, about our the different experiences. So anyway, I think there's a lot of cool work that could be done, and I like the idea of bringing us all together.
Yeah, I'm definitely going to propose that in my next email to the larger team. I think it would be really great, and to provide opportunities for all of you to offer feedback too on where could this project go, or where should it go next?
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay.
The next question is a little bit more of an environmental turn.
Oh.
So if you think about the management and stewardship of the Hahawakpadon Bassett Creek watershed, is there any advice that you would like to give to those who manage it, or any particular changes or initiatives you would like to see to the environmental aspect of this geographic area?
Well, Casey, I wish I had a really smart thing to say here, but I don't.
That's totally fine. Some people are,
yeah.
I mean, we've had some conversations, about access to housing and what that looked like. Some people are more interested in the environmental aspect. But I will say what I've learned through this project is that the watershed has not been treated well, which is perhaps probably not a surprise. It's, been highly polluted. There's a few golf courses that butt up to the Bassett Creek watershed. And then when the creek goes into Minneapolis, it's also tunneled before it enters into the Mississippi River. So there's obviously work that could and should be done.
Yeah, I mean, preservation is one word that comes to mind, and the importance of our water. Water is life for us anyway. So I think we tend, again, another area that probably we haven't spent a lot of time on or forget about, but I think there's something around preservation and, again, unearthing, pun intended, the history of the Bassett Creek and how it served people back in the day. And so I think here in Minnesota, sometimes we just take some of this stuff for granted, right? So I think there's something around preservation that would be important for the area for sure.
Right. So as a Native person, or a Native person who's also African American and is a woman, is there anything that you would like future generations to know about your experiences in a predominantly white suburb?
I will say that it's not fun to kind of feel like you're alone. And so, again, I think some of those acknowledgements and recognition that there's more than white people in this area, and that everyone matters and everyone counts. So I think that for me, growing up, I always felt very isolated, or I would find the brown person or find I was always sort of gravitating to that, and definitely not learning about my history and doing that all on my own. And so as we go forward, I think there's an opportunity for, again, lessons and acknowledgement, and whether it's one or two people, still, like, nobody wants to be ignored or forgotten or looked over. And so I think that this community, these schools could do a much better job of recognizing the diversity of the neighborhood. And if they don't think they exist, then they have to pause and ask who's here, because like we like to say, we're still here.
Yeah.
And so I think there's still work to be done. I'm so thankful for this project and this conversation, because, again, it's not one that's had very often, and that needs to continue.
Absolutely. I'm thankful for this project for similar reasons. And I'm really looking forward to that June 4th event, where we can see members of this community, Native and non-Native, also come together and learn from each other and just kind of have some dialogue as well. So before we wrap up, is there anything else that you would like to share that we may have missed?
I can't think of anything. I think, yes, really good questions, Casey. Again, I want to thank you for your time, because, again, it's just a conversation that has never taken place. So I don't know if I had really good answers or responses for you today, because I personally haven't given this a lot of thought. It was just my experience, right? And so I will say that a lot of the work I do is in social justice, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And maybe because I felt always excluded, I'm always trying to include people. And so even my work that I do in my day-to-day is about creating that inclusive place and having these sort of harder conversations and just sort of the importance of it. And so again, I who knew, right? And so I just really am impressed with the fact that you're doing this work and that there's a conversation happening here. Miigwech, thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, this has been so great. You know, when I tell people the kind of work that I do with suburban Indians, they're always kind of like, huh, I never thought of that, but it makes sense, you know? And then when you not only think about American Indians and suburbs, but that suburbs really are historically Indian places. And when we think about places across the West Metro, places like Wayzata, Minnetonka, you know, all these place names, people are like, oh yeah, you know, Minnesota. But it takes some critical thinking or having these critical conversations to really interrogate what that means. So I'm appreciative of you and all the other participants who have shared and taken kind of this critical turn with me.
Yeah. And, you know, one other thought I'm just having as we're closing out, I do think that we could do a better job of also educating our tribes of the validating all of these experiences and not one over the other, right? You have African American people who have grown up in the suburbs as well. They didn't grow up in the inner city,
right?
Or air quotes, the ghetto, so to speak, right? And so you have people who, again, I think the media and social, you know, they kind of paint these pictures that are not accurate,
right?
But I also think we have to be able to go back to our communities and talk more about that. You're not more one or the other because you grew up either on the res or in the suburbs or in the city. Like, so I think we tend to do that to ourselves. And I think there's a good conversation, you know, you need to take it home and have those conversations as well. So not only educating where we are and those in the community, but taking it back home as well, I think is probably an opportunity that we haven't really work we just haven't done yet. So just a side note. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening. This project may serve as a model for other communities that seek to go beyond land acknowledgement. To learn more about this oral history project, please contact Hennepin History Museum. The project was produced following the standards and principles of the Oral History Association. In addition to this podcast, the interview recordings, transcripts, and narrator files included signed legal released agreements can be found at the Hennepin History Museum. Funding and other support was provided by the St. Anthony's Falls Heritage Board, Hennepin History Museum, Valley Community Presbyterian Church, and the University of Wisconsin. This publication was also made possible in part by the people of Minnesota through a grant funded by an appropriation to the Minnesota Historical Society from the Minnesota Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund. Any views, findings, opinions, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this publication are those of the authors and do not necessarily represent those of the state of Minnesota, the Minnesota Historical Society, or the Minnesota Historic Resources Advisory Committee. Anaya chopta pecha wopira unkenichiapi. Thank you for listening.